In the 1160s, a Canterbury monk drew a map of water. It showed pipes, settling tanks, and taps feeding clean spring water across a whole monastery. The grit dropped out in stone basins. The water ran into a tower, then down to the kitchens. People drank it every day without a second thought. Clean water on tap, centuries before anyone had heard of chlorine. At least, that is the story we like to tell. But the same century has a second story, and this one is grim. A few streets away, other people drank from wells that were quietly killing them. One source safe for a lifetime, the next deadly by spring. So which medieval water was actually clean? And what did those monks understand that we seem to have thrown away? Tonight we put the medieval well on trial. Who really had safe water, how they managed it without a single chemical, and what we quietly forgot the day we started treating the pipe instead of guarding the source. It ends somewhere that should not make sense, in one of the biggest cities on earth, where millions of people today still drink water kept safe the medieval way, and almost none of them know it. Start with the thing almost everyone believes about the Middle Ages, because it turns out to be wrong. You have probably heard that medieval people did not drink water at all, that it was so filthy, so dangerous that everyone lived on beer and wine instead, from the children to the monks to the king. It is a tidy story. It is also mostly invented. The records simply do not back it up. Ordinary people drank water all the time. It was the free drink, the poor person's drink, the thing you reached for when you were thirsty and had nothing else in your hand. Pilgrims drank from springs along the road. Labourers drank from wells in the field. The monastic rules talk about water as a plain, daily, unremarkable thing. The idea that an entire civilization spent 1,000 years gently drunk because the water would kill them is something we invented much later, looking back and feeling clever. None of that means they never touched ale. They drank it constantly, including a weak everyday brew, often called small ale, that was cheap and filling and mild enough to hand a child. But that is exactly the detail the myth twists out of shape. Weak ale was a drink they liked and could afford, not a desperate stand-in for a water supply they all secretly feared. The two sat side by side on the same table. The myth survives because it flatters us. It lets us picture the past as one long stretch of ignorance that we heroically climbed our way out of. That clears one myth and hands us a much harder question. If they were drinking the water, and most of them were plainly not dropping dead, then some of that water had to be genuinely safe. Not blessed, not boiled, safe. The only question worth asking is which water and why. And the moment you pull on that thread, the neat picture comes apart in your hands. Medieval water was never one thing. It was two completely different worlds, sitting almost on top of each other, and the gap between them was the gap between an ordinary year and a very ugly death. Picture the version nobody prints on a postcard. In a crowded town, your well was a hole sunk into the ground, and not far from that hole sat a cesspit. A cesspit was exactly what it sounds like, a lined pit for human waste, and towns were riddled with them, often just a few feet from the wells people drank from. You can guess what happened when the two met underground. Waste seeped through the soil, into the groundwater, and back up into the bucket. The result had a name. They called it the bloody flux, what we would call dysentery, and it rolled through medieval towns in waves. It took children first and fastest. On campaign it killed more soldiers than the actual fighting did. It killed kings in their own castles. This was not a rare disaster that struck once a generation. It was the background hum of living anywhere the water had gone bad. And here is what tends to get lost. People knew. They did not understand germs, but they were not fools, and they could see and smell precisely what was wrong. Town authorities watched it happen and tried to legislate it away. In London, neighbours hauled each other in front of the city court over cesspits dug too close, over filth leaking through a shared wall, over a well fouled by a butcher's runoff. There were rules about lining your pit with stone and setting it back from the boundary. There were fines for getting it wrong. The trouble was never the awareness. It was enforcement and crowding and the plain physics of drawing your drinking water and burying your sewage out of the same patch of earth. You would think the sheer volume of complaints would eventually have fixed it. It never did. The ground kept doing what ground does, and the water kept winning. Worse still, a single public well might serve a whole street or a whole parish, so when it turned, it did not sicken one household. It sickened a neighbourhood all at once. The rivers were often worse than the wells. The same stretch one family drew to drink might have a tannery bleeding into it just upstream, and a row of privies leaning out over it just downstream. The version you have heard of a uniformly filthy medieval world is not quite the full picture. The filth was real. It was just not the whole map. Because in those same towns, sometimes a few streets over, there were people drinking water that was reliably, year after year, safe. They had not gotten lucky. They had built something. So pay close attention to this next part, because it explains everything that follows. The medieval people who had safe water almost never drew it from the well next door. They reached past the local ground entirely. They went and found something clean, far off, and built the means to carry it home. Go back to that monk in Canterbury. The priory there did not trust the town's ground, so they ran a pipe out to springs more than a kilometre beyond the city walls, up on higher, cleaner land. The water came in by gravity, through settling tanks that let the dirt sink out into a holding tower and then around the precinct to taps and basins. A protected source. A sealed pipe. The grit stripped out on the way. And we are not guessing at any of this because the prior who built it had the entire system drawn out in detail, every pipe and tank and tower set down on the page, and that drawing still survives. It is the same map of water you saw at the very start, one of the most detailed engineering plans to reach us from the medieval world. Every step of it exists to do one job, keep the water away from the filth. And Canterbury was no lonely exception. People assumed the great medieval water systems were rare monastic toys. That is the version you have heard, and it is wrong. London built a public one for everybody. In the 1240s, the city ran lead pipes more than 3 miles from the springs at Tyburn into a great stone cistern in the middle of Cheapside, where any Londoner could come and draw clean water. That conduit served the city for the better part of 400 years, until the Great Fire finally took it. In Exeter they went one step stranger and dug passages underground, vaulted stone tunnels you can still walk through today, for a single reason, so that when the pipes needed mending, a man could climb down and fix them without tearing up the street above. In Siena, in Italy, they hand-cut an entire hidden network through the hills, miles of tunnels, just to bring spring water down into the city fountains. Some of it is still flowing now, and think about the patience that took. The Siena tunnels were cut by hand through solid rock, foot by foot, by men who would never see the whole thing finished in their own lifetime. They were not building for themselves. They were building for grandchildren they would never meet, on the bet that clean water was worth 100 years of digging. That is the part that should stop you. We tend to picture medieval people as scraping by from one harvest to the next. But here were whole towns making century-long investments in something they could not sell and might never live to drink. Safe water was worth that much to them. But most people were never going to build a 3-mile conduit, and the remarkable thing is that they did not have to. The same thinking scaled all the way down to a single village. A good country well was not just a hole in the dirt. It was dug deep, lined with stone to hold the walls and stop the surface filth washing in, and very often covered, or set under its own little roof. The community guarded it with unwritten rules everyone understood without being told. No washing your clothes in it. No watering your animals at it. You kept the dirty work downstream and the well itself clean, because the whole settlement drank from that one spot. A protected spring on the hillside, walled and roofed and left alone, could pour out safe water for longer than the oldest person alive could remember. That was the everyday version of the very same idea the monks had carved into stone. And the detail almost everyone misses is the one that turns this whole video around. Look at what those systems actually did to the water. The settling tanks dropped out the grit. The pipes kept it sealed. The springs were chosen because they ran off clean, high ground. Now notice what is not on that list. Nobody added anything. Nobody treated the water. There was no disinfectant, no chemical, no clever additive that killed what was living in it. That is because, to them, water safety was never a chemistry problem. It was a geography problem. The whole method, the part we keep calling primitive, comes down to one idea so simple it is almost embarrassing to say out loud. Do not clean dirty water. Keep the water from getting dirty in the first place. Find a clean source, wall it off, cover it, seal it into a pipe, and keep the waste and the animals and the tanners as far downstream as you can manage. When it worked for generations, because there was nothing left in the water to fail. A protected spring does not have an off day. It does not run out of chlorine on a Tuesday. The safe medieval water stayed safe for the same reason a sealed jar stays clean. Nothing dirty was ever let in. The modern world quietly did the exact opposite, and that is the whole reason your tap needs chemicals at all. None of this has to stay locked behind glass in the past. The people who worked it out were ordinary households, not specialists, and the old hands-on skills are still here for anyone who wants them. If this makes you want to put your own hands on the past instead of just watching it, that is what the Medieval Way store is for. It starts with the Medieval Bakery Collection. The Practical Recipes book covers the dishes themselves. The Sourdough Manual is for keeping a living leaven of your own. And the Sourcing Guide points you to real heritage grain. The bread is where this kitchen begins. While the monks were quietly piping clean water in, the world they did it for was already outgrowing the only method that made it possible. Because what actually changed was not that we got dumber. It was that we got bigger. A medieval town of a few thousand could guard one spring on a hill and pipe it in clean. A modern city of 9 or 10 million simply cannot. There is no single clean spring on earth big enough to water a place like that. The water has to come from rivers and reservoirs dozens of miles off, and then crawl through enormous networks of buried pipe to reach every last tap. And that is the exact moment the medieval method breaks. The instant your water has to travel 100 miles through aging pipe shared by millions of people, you can no longer promise the source stays clean the whole way. Something will get in somewhere. A cracked main, a backflow, a fouled stretch of reservoir, anything along that vast journey. We could have shrugged and gone back to accepting dirty water. We refused. Around the turn of the 20th century, cities did something the medieval world never had to do. They started adding a chemical to the water on purpose. After deadly typhoid outbreaks, towns in England and then America began dosing the supply with chlorine, a disinfectant that does not just clean the water once, but keeps working the entire length of the pipe, killing whatever tries to slip in along the way. It worked. Chlorination is one of the real reasons people in big cities stopped dying of waterborne disease by the thousands. The scale of what replaced the old method is hard to even picture. A modern network can run tens of thousands of miles of pipe beneath a single city, much of it laid generations ago and quietly aging in the dark. No inspector can walk all of it. No wall can guard all of it. The chemical does the guarding now, riding inside the water itself, because nothing else could be everywhere at once. That is the whole trade in one sentence. We stopped protecting a place and started protecting the water mile by mile all the way to your sink. This is not a tidy tale about a chemical that poisoned something pure. Chlorine has saved millions of lives, and it still does, every single day. The honest point is narrower and stranger than that. We did not turn to chemicals because protecting the source had stopped working. We turned to them because we built cities too big to protect the source, and treating the water became the only way to keep it safe at that size. And in making the trade, we quietly buried the older idea until guarding the source began to feel optional, almost quaint. It was never wrong. It just went out of fashion. Here is the proof that the old idea still works, hiding in plain sight in one of the largest cities on Earth. New York supplies water to roughly 9 million people, and most of that water never passes through a filtration plant at all. It does not need to. For more than a century, the city has spent its real effort protecting the land around its reservoirs up in the Catskill Mountains, buying up the watershed, guarding the forests and streams that feed it, keeping the pollution out before it can ever get in. They protect the source. It is the Canterbury monk's idea, running at a scale he could never have dreamed of, and it comes out cheaper and cleaner than building a giant plant to scrub the water after the fact. And New York is not even alone. A handful of other large cities that still draw from carefully guarded mountain watersheds have earned the same rare permission to skip full filtration for exactly the same reason. It is not a loophole they found. It is that protecting the source genuinely produces water clean enough that you barely have to touch it at the other end. The chemistry is still there as a backstop, a thin line of safety for the long trip through the pipes. But the heavy lifting is done the old way, up at the top, by keeping the dirt out of the water in the first place instead of chasing it back out later. So go back one last time to that map of water the monk drew in the 1160s. We used to read it as a quaint relic, a clever trick from a backward age we long ago left behind. It reads more like a warning we only half remembered. Those monks were not behind us. On the one question that actually decides whether water is safe, where it comes from, and whether you bother to guard it, they were asking exactly the right thing. The wells and springs that gave clean water for centuries did not manage it by luck, and not with chemicals. They managed it because someone decided the water was worth protecting long before it ever reached the cup. The story was never really about the old world against the new. It was about a single choice every civilization has to make, and one we are quietly making again. We dig up what the modern world buried. Subscribe, then tell me, which got you more, the cesspit beside the well or a city drinking like a monk? Stay curious.